Welcome, everybody. So my first thing is apologies from Professor Cook because he's not feeling well, and he was going to start off talking about the student staff contract, and we decided that that's really his ambit of concern and responsibility. So we'd move on to what was on the schedule still for my next teaching engagement, which is this. The part 2 of the teaching portfolios, which I gave a few weeks ago, was part 1, and that is what goes into a teaching portfolio. Now we thought between Lizelle and I will unpack for you what are the criteria actually that those teaching portfolios are adjudicated against. Um, we all know that it's quite easy to quantify the kind of teaching that you do. You know, how many classes and how many hours and how many students. But that doesn't really tell us anything about your teaching development. And the whole idea of a teaching portfolio is to show progression over time. So Christine, if you can let me share my screen, I'll see what I can do here. As you will see, oh, that's so easy. There we go. So, sorry, just trying to get back to the page where I can actually see you and see what you're doing while you can see what I'm doing. Can you see what I'm doing?
We can see it.
We can see it, Chair.
Great. Okay, let's go ahead. So even if it's not big enough, I think it should be big enough, don't you think? Is there anybody who thinks that they can't see it?
I think you can zoom in a bit.
Okay, I can do that. Let's make it a bit bigger. How's that?
That's
get
good.
rid of that again. Okay.
Yeah, that looks good.
All right, excellent. So when we spoke about constructing a teaching portfolio, we had these sets of categories, okay, which was telling us what you've actually done. So you've taught a whole bunch of classes within a block or within a year degree, or you do clinical teaching of students that come through in groups, etc. So it's how many you've done and how many students you've seen and what's the context. Is it bedside? Is it chairside? Is it in small tutorial groups? Is it in huge lecture theatres? That's one of the things you need to document. Then we said you had to develop a teaching philosophy, which is one of those events that we're going to do as maybe part 3 of this teaching portfolio idea. We look at teaching practice, which is how much you've had to do with things like course design and assessment methods, and also what teaching methods have you experimented with, or what different things have you done, or do you do the same things, and if they are, what are they? So what you actually do. The next part was reflection of the impact, so really effectiveness on student learning of your teaching. So there's a guy called John Hattie who writes what he calls visible learning. And he's done a whole set of huge meta-analyses, which speaks to how we understand whether students have learned or not. Now, a lot of us have spent many, many, many years doing face-to-face teaching and loving that because you can actually see audience response when you teach. However, that's not the only modality to see audience response, and audience response is not the only modality for checking whether students have actually learned anything from you. So it's worth unpacking that as an idea. Then the tying of it all together. So if this is philosophy, your philosophy, and this is what you do, and this is how you think it's working, then how do you measure your own professional growth?
I think PVT went offline after load shedding, so let's just give Shira 2 minutes to join again.
Shira, let me know via WhatsApp that it is load shedding. She'll be back as soon as possible.
Thanks, guys. I want to know if you can hear me now.
We can hear you now, and your screen did stop sharing.
Did stop. Okay, let me share it with you again. It's jumped screens. That's a pain in the neck, isn't it? I need to find it again. Wow. Okay, let's just share it from here then. Okay. So much for busy organization. Although I do have to say I had my phone at the ready so that I could jump onto. Thanks, Mervyn. It's nice to know that it is actually working.
The side is cut off a bit, so you might
So,
just have
okay,
to
make it a bit smaller. Okay,
yes.
let's do that. I'll tell you why, because it's on another screen now. How weird is that? Yes, no, there we go. That
Yes.
should work. Okay. So we were talking about tying it all together, right? So demonstrating your own professional growth. So I said when we were talking about the teaching portfolio that you need 3 evaluations of your teaching. They don't all have to be student evaluations, but you need 3 of them. And so when people are rushing for promotion, they come running into our offices and they say, can you just give me these 4 master students and then that clinical group that I taught, and then I did one big lecture once like a year ago, and send it to all the students. And then I'll have 3 evaluations. So that's not what they mean. When they talk about demonstration of professional growth using your evaluations, it's about showing how your philosophy's changed, or how your practice has changed in relation to the feedback that you get from the evaluations, and how you tie it in to the kind of teaching and teacher that you would like to be. And then the very last thing that we would look at in terms of the actual teaching portfolio is there any recognition of teaching excellence? So, for example, has somebody been nominated for an award? You don't have to actually have won it. You can add that to your list. And if anybody has won any kind of award, and there are actually quite a few teaching awards around and about now. So that's something that you would then put into your teaching portfolio, and we would adjudicate. So now let's unpack a little bit more of what we mean in terms of how we would adjudicate whether something is actually fulfilling the criteria that we're looking for in the portfolio. And if we look on the far right of the screen, that's the good side, okay? If we're looking at the left of the screen, it tells you what the criteria and sort of variables are. And the one that you want to be graded in is the expert. There's also absolutely fine, which is proficient, and then the ones which could do with some improvement. And often when you start in the developing area and you get feedback and you move upwards, that's exactly what, for example, a promotions committee would like to see. That you've taken on board feedback. Nobody starts perfect. And if you do get perfect scores, then it's really, really difficult to improve. So it's quite nice when you can say, oh gosh, I tried a new intervention and my class absolutely hated it. And then when I gave them more chance to get used to it, well, then they liked it. And now they would like to do it like that all the time. So certainly worth charting your development. I do have to say that first of all, in relation to those categories, nobody's kind of jumping up and down and saying, aren't you looking at anything else? So if it does occur to you that there are things that we should be looking at, I'm very open to discussion about that. And I really would welcome your interaction with how it is that we're looking at the teaching in relation to the work that all of us do. You know, when we have stood in front of the class, when we do try something new or not, as the case may be. So with regard to the actual portfolio, so I often tell people that it's useful if you keep a table of your teaching, because it's actually amazing how very soon you forget the things that you've done. And by forget the things you've done, I mean, you know, if you've got a timetable or a schedule, that's one thing. But if you're doing things ad hoc, you don't often remember. So while I have a coughing break, I'm going to ask you guys to drop in the chat with regard to the teaching history and context. Can you see the variations in how we're adjudicating what we'd like to see in the teaching portfolio versus what we'd not? And I'd like you to drop in the chat the thing that you find most surprising about the things that we value about your teaching context and experience. And that's from what I'm showing you on the screen, obviously.
If somebody's brave enough to talk us through while Shira's catching her breath, that is also welcomed.
May I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. There are a couple of things that you've said already, Shira, that for me are quite important as a clinician. One of the comments you made is submitting your portfolio for promotion. But surely the object of the exercise primarily is self-improvement. That very definitely for me would be, if not at the top, very close to the top. The next thing is evaluation. And there must be very big differences in terms of evaluating a didactic, academic type of teaching ability as opposed to, from where I'm coming from, and I might be talking out of context, the clinical teaching, which relies very much on the ability to assess situations and demonstrate how to assess situations from a clinical perspective. Those were the two areas in terms of history and context. So, you know, although they may be relevant, one has to put it into perspective in terms of the type of teaching that is being done, A, by whom, and B, to whom. Thanks.
Thanks, Mervyn. That's actually spot on for both your comments. The first one being that your teaching portfolio is obviously not constructed just for promotion. In fact, we encourage early teachers to develop a portfolio and let it follow them throughout their teaching life, through institutions, and also as you change responsibilities and you do different types of teaching. It is very much predicated on your own development. And the only thing is that development, yes, does take self-reflection, but it also does take input from others. And so I think it is one of the things that we don't like to do, but I think it's important to to talk it over with, for example, CHSE, as in terms of the learning advisors, or to ask for feedback from your classes or from peers, etc., because that is what really informs whether you're getting through to your students or not. With regard to the type of teaching, yeah, obviously evaluating different types of teaching has different goalposts, which we can break down in more detail if you like. What amazes me about our faculty is, and it's one of the really amusing things about comparing teaching across the university, which is what the old card-based system used to do, and they tried to do with Blue Explorers. And that is that the Faculty of Health Sciences consistently scores higher than most other faculties. And the clinical teachers within the faculty score even higher than the teachers who are teaching theory in a classroom. And my sense is that students are incredibly grateful when they see something demonstrated to them well, and when they get it, when they're standing by the bed and they actually realize that they can do it too, or they got the point of what you were saying, or they saw what you were indicating. So when students do evaluations of clinical teaching, the numbers are through the top of the charts, unless, of course, it was a ghastly session, in which case they're really low. But I do have to say that the majority of our clinical teachers score very highly. And the comment made from Central University is, clearly it's the type of experience and not the staff that you have. And we were going, clearly it's the staff that we have and not the type of experience. So I do have to say that students rate clinical teaching very highly. I'm not even sure if it's in relation to the clinical teacher, although obviously some are very clear and the students really vibe with that. But also the concept of being in the work environment, seeing real world problems and coming at it from different angles is something that really appeals to students. So they tend to evaluate clinical teaching really highly. Yeah, Lizelle, I'm reading what you're saying in the chat. Yeah. And Christine, I like that too, because people come in and do what they do, but they need to know if it's working or if it's not working. And if you're not sensitive to the fact that it may not be working, then you might dig yourself into a hole because you come in and you do the same thing all the time. So yeah, I definitely think that looking at the type of teaching does make a difference, but in our context specifically, you can develop your, and we had this idea of a signature pedagogy, which is teaching directly related to your special area, and being able to articulate that. Why is my teaching different from somebody else's? Let's look at how that, yeah, Mervyn, go ahead. You don't have to put up your hand, just jump in.
I don't want to be abusive. We are in a very unique position, which again has to be adapted according to the circumstances. As you're aware, there is the NMFC group, and I'm part of a group of 3 teaching obstetrics and gynecology, and we are all specialists in the field. And interestingly, we review one another. We haven't, unfortunately, had more senior or external reviews, which is probably a sad deficiency. But then again, it would be difficult for perhaps a non-specialist to evaluate what would be a value at a specialist level. However, coming to the review bit, between the 3 of us, we generally assess one another or assess the results of our combined teaching and draw on one another's expertise or problems in order to try and improve literally from group to group. And we have tried to do that over the last couple of years, I believe, relatively successfully. But it's an important issue in terms of how do you assess and how quickly must you modify? Thanks.
So I like that because, yeah, Lizelle, go ahead.
So I just want to jump in. The what we sometimes forget, and it might be a gap in our rubric, and it's something that I want to ask people to comment on. What do they think is missing, that they feel that is important in one of these criterias that we are not touching on? But when we are evaluating teaching, we sometimes think that a person needs to be a content expert or a subject matter expert. But what is the goal of an evaluation? It's around the teaching practice. And so you don't need to be a content expert, but you need to be a expert in how the content is being relayed to a student. And we need to make that distinction when we are evaluating teaching, that it's not content specific, but it's the process of delivering. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
You absolutely are, and that's exactly where I was going to go with that. Daniela, do you want to join the conversation?
Thanks. Yes, because afternoon, everyone. I wanted to make that comment with Lizelle. I've had experiences with working with colleagues from CLTD who aren't necessarily content experts, but in reviewing something as basic as a rubric, because I find what happens in health sciences, because we content experts, we assume we then experts also in terms of teaching and learning, or as an educationalist. And one of the things that was flagged on my part about my rubric was that it did not meet NQF level 7 requirements. Whereas I thought my rubric was perfect. It had all the content, like aspects of content I wanted to assess, but in terms of for a degree program, it was not at NQF level, in terms of the objectives that I had set out. And so, Lizelle, you really correct in that, and I think it's slowly trying to bring in educationalists into our practice. That is very important, so that we can, because sometimes we also think just bombarding people with content will make them competent. And sometimes we need to just be very, very mindful of that when we are reviewing our teaching.
Thanks, Daniela. That's really helpful because you've highlighted exactly the point that Lizelle was pulling through, which is that it actually isn't the content. You do have to have obviously correct content and a way of putting that across so that it's accessible to students and where they can build it into something that makes sense to them. But it's a lot about the congruence of your offering in relation to the program that they're doing and in relation to the timing of the program, and whether it fits or not. And I think that that's part of working in a team as well, that when you have different groups coming through, you get a chance to try things slightly differently, which I think can be fun. Yeah, definitely. Lizelle gave you the gold star. That's very cool. So it's a good opportunity to then look at the content area of teaching philosophy, which we're up to on the screen over here. And that is basically how you think students learn and what you do with that thinking. So what decisions have you made in your teaching practice in line with the view of how you think students learn? Because I often have young members of staff come in and they learn about theories of learning. We do like a short course or something, and they come to me and say, oh, I would love to teach in a constructivist manner, but my line manager won't allow me. My head of department says I still have to go and give the lecture and do MCQs, and that's it. So I think that it is important to have an idea of how we think people learn. And that then allows us to be advocates, to actually motivate and to have a voice in the teaching in our particular area. because I think for a long time people felt that the curriculum choices, the assessment choices were completely out of their hands. And I do think that we have COVID to thank for a lot of people realizing that actually things can change, and they can change quite dramatically and quite fast. I don't know if anybody's experiences over COVID relayed that to them and allowed them to make some changes that they liked and would in fact even keep compared with what they used to do before.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I
Fine.
think the logistics of teaching were the biggest things one had to navigate and adapt to. So I think for me, just the sheer logistics of making sure how you deliver your content was one of the biggest things from the COVID experience. Because I don't think so much the content really changed. I don't think COVID has had much an impact on the content changing, but the logistics and the methodology and the fact that I think what COVID also did was people had heard about universal learning design or had given it lip service. They had to actively do it now in health sciences. And be mindful how different learners receive information and just different learning practices from students.
So I like the laughter in your voice. That was laughing, not crying, right?
Yes, it was laughing.
Just that COVID was very stressful, I think, for a lot of people, but it did give us this opportunity to say, are there ways that I can do things differently with logistical arrangements? For example, online learning happened very fast, and students did get used to some aspects of it, and some aspects they enjoyed, possibly others not. And our faculty particularly got back into the wards very fast. So our work integrated learning was not that compromised. However, we became much more aware of numbers. And that was something that clinicians had been complaining about on an ongoing basis as the numbers just went up and up. And suddenly we were forced back into small groups. Sorry. And the only disadvantage of that, obviously, sorry. Okay, clear, I think. So the only disadvantage of that, obviously, is having to put in more teaching hours, because the smaller the group, the more often you have to do it, right, Daniela?
Sorry, I was going to interject whilst you were catching your breath. I think one of the logistics that we had to really be conscious of, I think, because people just assume going online would be cost effective. Or sometimes we think these new teaching methodologies, for example, we were all excited to introduce simulation, but the cost implications, of, for example, these high fidelity simulators and equipment, an increasing number of students, the cost of data and connectivity for students. It's the things that can compromise. So even, compromise the teaching needs for certain departments. So yeah, I think sometimes when we talk, we hardly have a discussion about cost and the availability of those resources. So much as we again, as you said, it's always the young educators. We're really, really eager, and then you get to put the proposal forward, and the first thing is cost. And that, I think, for me has been the most demotivating factor when thinking about how you want to be a skilled medical or a clinical educator.
So that is absolutely a fascinating point, and I think that's something that people should think about incorporating in their portfolio. So ways that they've tried to make things easier for students with regard to the types of teaching enhanced technology that we're looking at. I don't know if you can see in the chat, I have dropped in the WITS website page that speaks about data access. So students who are not in residence and who do not have overseas cell phone numbers, now they have finished negotiating with all of the cell phone providers that they're going to get 20 gigs of daytime data and 20 gigs of nighttime data per month if they sign up on the form, which is on that particular page. So for undergraduates and some postgraduates, that might be something that saves the day because they have negotiated those special rates.
Shira, before you carry on, I just want to highlight something because it speaks to what Daniela said about the cost implications and how you have to change your way of teaching or what considerations you are making. But I think the first point that you need to sit down and make clear for yourself is what do you value in teaching? Because it's easy to make adaptations, but you might lose what you want to bring across to the students. And sometimes we are not aligning our how we're teaching or our teaching practices with what we value, what the students need to be able to achieve at the end of the day. We're going into what's comfortable for us. But I think that value system or what you value, you need to have a clear understanding for yourself as to what you want, what it is that make you a good teacher or a teacher, and what do you value that you want to bring across.
So Lizelle, thanks. I think that's really useful because a lot of people feel like they have to do bells and whistles teaching, is what I call it. You know, that you're the edutainer in the classroom, that you're vivacious, that you do exciting things that students talk about. And actually, a lot of that doesn't lead to student learning. It leads to attention and it leads to them liking you. But they still have to go home and learn stuff rather than assimilating it in your classroom. So I think that, yes, change in behavior and trying to look at your philosophy and aligning it with your practice is something that is important. And if you do come up with some weird and amazing and wonderful idea, like, you know, we're going to fly everybody to Italy to see the last appendix that was taken out in Pompeii, you know, we need to be logistical and practical about the kinds of learning experiences we want for our students. Anybody up for the trip? Okay, so that takes us to the idea of teaching practice. We were looking at philosophy before. Now, how do you tie in practice with a philosophy? Because that's one of the key areas that you'll be judged on in your teaching portfolio. And that speaks to, are your course goals appropriate for the students that you're teaching in the time that you're teaching them? The basic question is your content aligned with the curriculum? And this is what Daniela was saying earlier, is that if you have activities and if you're trying to provide lessons for students, but not at the level at which the program expects the students to be able to function, then you're doing your students a disservice, no matter how much fun they have in your classroom. And then they bring it down to the personal, which is how diverse is your teaching? In other words, do you accommodate diversity in your classroom? And how do you incorporate not only your own identity, but students' self-identities, you know, with regards to who they are and where they come from in the lessons that you're giving over. And this is an area that I think a lot of people just try and avoid. This is my class, this is how I'm giving it. People must just take it as it's given. And what we're looking for really is the issue of awareness of the diversity of what you're dealing with, and allowing people to participate from their own perspective. Daniela?
Sorry, I'm trying not to dominate the discussion.
No, we're very happy, and you're saving me a lot, so thanks.
I don't know whether this really is under the topic of, I think it is teaching practice, but I'm thinking more about the learning context, in that we striving to be students, like a student-centered learning, with the idea, you know, I've always thought of it, a student-centered learning is good because we are training clinicians, future healthcare professionals that need to have self-directed learning so that we can have evidence-based practitioners. So I always find with our students, or rather, there's always a group where that students, they struggle with that student-centeredness. You know, that student, you know, that practice of trying to get them to be problem-based, small group, that independent study. And I'm curious whether is it an issue with practice, or is it more the context of where the learning is happening? In that when it's in a lecture theater, in a lecture room, they expecting for you to give all the information. The fact that we're on med school, they expect us, but is it maybe I don't know, if the learning context, the learning environment changes, where we're bedside or in the clinical context, they are then forced that independent study, you know, when they do their clinical rotations. So I always struggle to say, is the best place for independent study are they only experiencing it in the clinical rotations and see the value of it? And there's an expectation when they are in a lecture hall, in a lecture theater, we must be the ones, you know, giving all the answers, and theirs is just to listen and take notes. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, that's absolutely sensible. And it's a really interesting question. Does the context then influence the student-centeredness behavior of the students? And I'd be interested in input from others as to whether you feel that the students in their clinical rotations do take more responsibility for their learning, or whether you feel that they give you the responsibility for teaching rather than them the responsibility for learning. Yandisa?
Good afternoon. So I have never taught in a classroom, so I wouldn't know whether things are different in a classroom. So I've always taught within the clinical space. So before I
I think you muted yourself.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Sorry. So I was just saying that I've never taught in a classroom. I've taught both GAMP and NMFC. GAMP when I was still at Bara, and before that when I was a Reg. And I found that when you have those tutorials that that are rostered in for the students that they're gonna get whenever it's rostered into, the students don't read beforehand. Very few read. And I remember I'd have colleagues who would actually walk out and decide they're not going to teach them because they haven't bothered to read beforehand. So I find that I don't know whether students need to be taught about student-centered learning or told at the beginning but there's an expectation that if someone else is going to teach me something, I can just go there as a blank slate and they must just fill me up with information. That's what I've experienced.
So that's really fascinating. And it is that element of if we are being student-centered, you know, whether it speaks to how it is that students expect to learn, or what it is they expect to get out of the learning engagement. Mervyn?
Does that not depend very much on one of your earlier comments in that, how students learn? And there are those who need absolute demonstration, literally step by step. And there are others who, like Andisa mentioned, may have done some preparatory work. And there are then again those who you challenge and they quite enjoy the stimulation of having to try and work it out. So the style must depend very much on the kind of individual that one is dealing with. Thanks.
So I do think you're right. People are different, but the expectation of, as Lizelle says in the chat, what level you wanting them to get from the session. So must they be capable of independent practice, or is this a practice session where they can get it wrong, where they can practice over and over until they start getting it right? What exactly is it that we're doing that you wanted to do from the session? And I do have to say that I think that our students have an obsession with getting it right. In front of a clinician, they don't want to be seen to be making mistakes. And it plays out in the kinds of things you ask them to do. So you guys who teach clinical skills know that when a student gets into GMP3 and somebody in the wards asks them to do something, they all hide behind each other and go, no, no, we weren't taught that in clinical skills, when actually they were, because they just don't know if the clinician is going to say they've done it right or not. And they don't want to look like they didn't do it right. So yeah, there is that perfection thing that comes through. Now, while you were talking, I was actually trying to pull a reference into the chat, and I don't know why I didn't do it for some reason. There's a guy called Paul Kirschner. Okay. I don't know where it went to. Maybe Christine will find it for me just now. Maybe I'm uploading it to the actual team because I've pulled it in twice now and it keeps disappearing on me. He wrote a paper called Why Minimal Guidance Doesn't Work. In terms of developing student-centeredness. And this speaks directly to teaching practice. And I think his point is not that we shouldn't encourage student-centeredness. We want students to take responsibility, to seek things out, to practice, to fail and to try again, all of those things. But we do need to give them a strong enough scaffold. So what Lizelle commented, which is the bedrock of it, the student needs to know what it is they need to be able to do and to what level. And if they know that, then allowing them space to do that learning is a very student-centered practice, even if you're scaffolding step by step through a particular thing. So let's move a little bit further through. We were speaking about your repertoire, the teaching that you do, and then also the associated assessment. So one of the things I find our staff is most paralyzed by is the idea of changing assessment and the ways that we know whether students know. So just as a show of hands, I need to know if anybody's done any informal assessment in the arena that they're in, either in clinical teaching or in a classroom, to see what students are doing. And in assessment, I include things like audience response technology, where you can ask questions and then get the class to answer you electronically so that you can see what exactly is happening. Anybody done anything like that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think like Kahoot, where
Yes.
you
Yeah.
could use Kahoot, and that helps a lot in case-based learning. When they have a case, and obviously you want to see their responses towards working through their clinical reasoning. It does help.
Yeah, which is a safe space for them to try things, right? But you still want to know that your class knows what, you want to know whether the class knows. And that, in a way, is actually, yes, Anastasia, polls also. So you can get some response from your class, and that, in its way, is informal assessment. There's also that thing called a minute paper. If you are sitting face to face with your class, at the end of the class, get them to tear off half a piece of paper and write down, you can set them any task. What were the 2 things you learned in this lesson that you didn't know before? Or what was the one thing that wasn't clear to you by the end of this lesson? Rather don't go for perceptions like, did you like the lesson or did you enjoy it or that kind of stuff, because that's not really what you want to know. You want to know if you got through to them and if they are making meaning of the things that you're doing. Yeah. So exactly that, Yandi. So you don't want the students to go, I'm going to learn this because it's going to be in the exam. You want them to go, I'm going to learn this so that I'm a good healthcare practitioner. And ultimately, that's how you need to teach them also. I mean, obviously, you want them to pass exams, but you also want them to be professional people who try their best, right? And assessment speaks to that, because we know that students will be guided by what the objectives are and how they feel they're going to be assessed. And I think that that's one of the areas that people feel that they have least control about if a department particularly has a way of assessing. But there are things, as I'm saying, that you could probably do in your class that help you understand whether your students are actually getting there. So we're almost done, because we're coming now to the part where you can score highly on your teaching portfolio for yourself and to show yourself that you really are making progress. Because I would say that it's really important to take a breath, to do the teaching that you do, yes, and to thoroughly enjoy it, but then to take a step back and to say, am I teaching true to myself? Is this kind of teaching the kind of teaching I want to do for a while? Do I think it's meaningful teaching? Do I think students are experiencing meaningful learning? And is it as aligned as it should be? Danielle, I'll go back to your example from earlier, where sometimes it takes somebody from outside to look at your crafting of a lesson and its possible assessment. Excuse me. Yeah, so outside input is important, basically. Because sometimes we just can't really see it for ourselves. But what's useful is to have a spot in your teaching life where you do sit back and reflect. And that's why I think this rubric is important, because it gives you points of reflection to think about. And you could even write reflections to put into your portfolio, so that when you come to have to, for example, justify, wow, I'm struggling now, sorry, justify a change in practice, for example, you have reflections to back that up. It's also really fun, like 10 years on, to open your teaching portfolio and see what you were reflecting on at the time, and then see where you are now. So who's going to take that up as a challenge? I think that's a fun thing to do. Okay. In terms of demonstration of clinical growth, professional growth of yourself, really, that's a lot about in which fora do you participate. So now we absolutely preaching to the converted here, because you guys come here voluntarily to hear discussions about what exactly it is that we do. this is all about how much have you communicated the type of teaching that you do and your students' learning experiences too. Do you go to conferences? And by the way, I think it's a good opportunity to tell you, for those of you who don't know, there is the South African Association of Healthcare Educators. They call it SAHI, and they're going to have a conference at the end of June, and registration for that conference is now open. I don't know, Christine, if you've got a moment to look up the SAHI Conference 2023 and drop a link for the website page into the chat so that people can see, yeah, what it is. Thanks, Anastasia. The coffee really does help you, right? Hot drinking. So going to things like conferences and seminars and talking to people about your teaching not only makes it clearer in your own head, but it also helps you to understand the importance of sharing the kind of work that you do. People who have a lifetime's experience, for example, of a particular kind of teaching should share that experience with others, whether it's at conferences or writing papers, for example, because people tend not to think about writing the education papers. They think about writing the papers in the field that they're working in. And you could really share a lot of your experience and also join a global conversation with regard to particular practices and how it is that we approach our teaching. So it is definitely part of your demonstration of your own confidence and professional growth to be able to attend this kind of thing and to be able to share. Thanks, Anastasia. That's great. So if people are interested, registration is still open. It's open. The early bird's still open till the 25th, I think. So let's wind it up then with this idea of recognition of teaching excellence. Is it important to go and win prizes and to be told you're a great teacher? So for personal development, it's nice. It's a stroke, but I don't think it's actually vital. I think the whole idea of being recognized sometimes puts pressure on people. And I don't know, we have some award-winning teachers still sitting in the meetings, so you can tell me about your experience of whether you feel it's useful in your own personal development. It's Lizelle I'm talking to, right?
Sure, I'm just thinking that yes, we've put down the awards and the prizes, but I think what was that fell off the criteria was and or being recognized by people. So if you are invited to be a keynote speaker in education based, so how are you recognized for teaching excellence? It's not just receiving an award and being nominated for something, because most of the awards are self-nominated, and I think okay, it's then judged by other people. But I think if you've been recognized and somebody's giving you a ask you to be a keynote in at the educational, that adds more value than receiving one award that is been that you have to contest with the whole university. And only if you received another award you can be considered for the other. So yeah, I think there's other ways of being recognized, and we must maybe consider those things as part of this. That's my sense.
Thanks, Lizelle. I like that. I mean, I really feel like you don't have to have an award to be recognized as somebody who's passionate about their teaching, or somebody who really does a good job every single time, or somebody who just loves to share it with others. So yeah, I'm with you. I think that we can definitely tweak that criterion. And I'm also going to thank Christine, not only for anchoring the discussion this afternoon, but for finding the information posted in the chat, which you can have a look at. And at this point, I'm going to say I think we've done interestingly to look at the whole draft of the rubric. But I want to know just from you guys if it has helped you to conceptualize how to capture your teaching in a very longitudinal manner, so that it helps you really be a thoughtful, reflective teacher going forward. Closing words, anybody? Suggestions for our rubric?
It's always good that you provoke, and that provocation is very valuable because it stimulates reflection. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for coming along, everybody. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers.